room?
That's what I did,
Okay,
I think.
perfect.
Okay, and now we're recording.
Yay! All right. Good morning,
I have the
everyone.
slides. Okay, perfect.
Perfect.
I'll show slides when you're done.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, we were having a little bit of technical difficulties this morning. Zoom decided to be complicated, but we're really glad you're all here. Welcome to the first seminar of CU Data Week. We're super excited to see you all. I just wanted to quickly give you an overview of some of the lectures we'll be having this week. We're starting off today with Camille and Sarah talking about how to be a strong collaborator. This evening we have free text in SAS, how to use Perl regular expressions. And then tomorrow we're doing data management and statistics in SAS. On Wednesday, we have data management and tables in R. On Thursday, we have figures in R and machine learning in R. And then we're finishing off on Friday with statistics in R. So feel free to join any and all of these that appeal to you. At the end of each lecture, we'll be sending out an attendance link. And when you sign the attendance link, you'll be entered into a raffle. And at the end of the week, we'll be raffling off things like an iPad or Garmin activity monitors or wireless headphones. And so we're super excited to be hosting this week for all of you. So now I'll pass it off to Camille and Sarah. We're going to tell you a little bit about how to be a strong collaborator with your statisticians. So.
Perfect. Let me get the slides going. All right, which view do you see? Regular or presenter?
Looks regular.
Okay. All right, well, like Lala said, thank you all so much for being here today. And we're gonna talk about tips for working with a statistician. So my name is Camille Hochheimer, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Schmiege, and we are both biostatisticians. I guess you could have our pictures and our names. We're both biostatisticians in CEDA, the Center for Innovative Design and Analysis. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to discuss first the different models of statistical support. Then we're going to talk about how to find and nurture a relationship with a statistician. And we're hoping that both statisticians and non-statisticians will have some good takeaways from the session. So for non-statisticians, we're hoping you can kind of understand when and how to include a statistician in your research team. And then for statisticians, we're hoping you can kind of understand better your responsibilities and goals as a statistician. And so we're going to start with a poll. I'm going to, there we go. Okay, so we'd like to know who's in the audience. Are you a student in the biostat department or another department? Are you a MPH student? Are you clinical faculty? Are you a faculty biostatistician? Are you other? If people feel comfortable, I'd love to know if you're in another position, because it looks like most people are others. So I'd love if people would be willing to share in the chat what your role is. And so we can kind of get a better idea of our audience. And I'll give us like a few more.
Right, looks like we have a research professional, a data analyst. Awesome. Assistant professor in reproductive sciences.
There we go. Awesome.
A lot of research professionals.
Perfect.
Research services professionals. Excellent.
So thank you all so much for sharing. And I hope this also goes without saying, but please feel free to ask as many questions as you have, either in the chat or even just like unmute yourself and ask those questions. We're happy to make this as interactive as possible since we are on Zoom after all. So I think now I'm going to pass it to Sarah to get us started.
Great, and I have the poll up. If I just click share results, will that kind of remove it from my screen? I think I'm an alternative host, so I'm seeing all of that.
I think you can just close it.
I can close it. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just want to give a little background on different types of statistical support. As Camille said, these things may also depend on how far along you are in your career. So some of the slides I developed were developed specifically to give the statistician perspective to non-statisticians. So I work with a group with a lot of clinical scholars, early career physician investigators, physician scientists. And so this was designed to help them understand ways to work with their statistician. But I think where you are in the research process, where you are in terms of statistical background, I think you can take what's relevant for yourself out of the slides. So in general, I kind of lump biostat support into these three general categories. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on collaboration versus consulting. I think of team science as sort of like a bigger version of collaboration. And we can definitely talk about it later in our hour here if there's time or interest. So you can probably go to the next slide, Camille. Great. So basically, I asked a group of clinicians on campus what collaboration versus consulting means to them. And some of the answers that I got were things like collaboration means working together as a team from the start. Consulting is coming in to answer a very specific and limited question. Or another person said collaboration, the biostatistician takes more ownership of the analysis, whereas in consulting, the biostatistician is only involved in a small piece of the research analysis. So like collaboration is more like an ongoing relationship, where consulting is a little bit more transactional. And so these were answers that I received from clinical collaborators, but I definitely agree with all of those answers. So I think of consulting as kind of more of a one-off model. It's often more fee for service. It's hourly based, whereas I think of collaboration as more of an ongoing, mutually rewarding relationship between some sort of principal investigator or some sort of clinical investigator and a statistician that's going to encompass more or all stages of the scientific process. So if you think of like a grant development where you might enlist a statistician to help you write a grant, help you think through study design, write the analysis plan for the grant, but also have a lot of input on the specific aims and how to translate those into the study design, which that would then be translated to the analysis plan. And then, you get the grant awarded and you write the statistician into the grant for some sort of FTE. And that's a process that takes a minimum of 5 years, but it's often more like 6 or 7 years. And, in an ideal world, it goes well. And that's somebody that you have then a longer term collaboration with. So yeah, it's kind of that more stages, and it kind of has that mutual rewarding relationship. And I'm kind of pitching them, I might be sounding like collaboration is better than consulting, but I don't want to give off that impression. I don't think that one of these two options is necessarily better than the other, but I think the one that's best is based on the specifics of a given scenario. So to give an example, consulting can be a really great option if you have a short-term project with maybe a fixed amount of work, well-defined endpoints. So some examples of short-term projects could be that if you have data that needs to be analyzed to be embedded in a larger grant application. So like if you have pilot data and you need to use those data to support some preliminary analyses for a larger grant, that's a good way to have a consulting biostatistician. A lot of the manuscripts that we do are really based on consulting relationships. You already have your data set, you've already carried out the study, and so you're enlisting the support of a statistician to carry out an analysis plan and help develop the manuscript. So those are all examples of consulting. And consulting can also be a good way to get guidance on developing that longer term relationship, that multiple year FTE-based relationship with a statistician. And like I said before, consulting often comes with more of an hourly payment rather than bringing a statistician on for some kind of given FTE. But if you're really looking for that longer term relationship, if you're interested in building that long-term mutually rewarding relationship, consulting is only going to get you so far. It's really more for that shorter time period. So a main drawback of consulting is that the statistician may not be involved through the entire length of the project. So it can be difficult if you're trying to get a statistician to analyze data that they really had no role in collecting. So like as statisticians, we're pretty good at identifying things about study design, having ideas about how to best design a study for different analyses. But if we're only kind of brought in at the back end, maybe we have a different solution or a different idea on how things might have been done better, but we never had the opportunity to weigh in on that. So that can be a downside of consulting. From the perspective of the statistician, I actually really enjoy both consulting and collaboration. I see them both as really rewarding, but I do see them as having different goals. Collaboration is about that relationship, ongoing life cycle of the project, and whereas consulting is that fixed project. So if you're not a statistician, if you're looking for a statistician, it really kind of depends on your needs. If you need something more short-term or more fixed, consulting definitely might meet your needs, and that's totally cool. That's totally fine. A couple of kind of pitfalls to avoid with consulting that I've noticed. I like to call these 5-minute questions where someone will say, oh, I need a statistical consult, but I just need a 5-minute question answered. And that's not really possible. I've never been able to answer a question in 5 minutes. If you're looking for a quick answer, that's really not where a statistician can play a good role. The other thing to avoid is something that I call bless this analysis, where someone basically maybe wants me to look at their code or look at their output or the results section and just say, hey, did I do this right? And that's first of all, that's not really consulting, and that's not something that we can do with a project. We kind of need to be a little bit more invested in the project to give a good answer on that. But aside from those pitfalls, the consulting model is a great way to get some shorter term analyses done, or to kind of begin your longer term relationship, longer term collaborative relationship with a statistician. All right, so that was a lot of detail on that single slide, but maybe you can go, I think we have a poll on the next slide. So here's another quick poll to get where people have kind of been in the past. And these might not all be mutually exclusive, but we'll kind of see where people end up on these. Great, it looks like just about everybody has responded. It looks like about almost half of the group has neither consulted nor collaborated. So I guess that's a good thing that we're all here in this Zoom today. And then maybe collaboration has been just a little bit more common than consulting for the people in the audience. Great. Anything you want to say about the poll, Camille, or do you see the results?
I think, yeah, it's interesting about half of you have never collaborated with a biostatistician. So I'm glad you're here.
All right, let me stop this thing. Okay, I think we can go forward to the next slide. And I just wanted to talk a little, I mentioned the word relationship a lot when I was talking about collaboration. And I just want to make a few points about working relationships. So some of these bullet points kind of assume you've already been working with a statistician you found somewhere. It also might be a little bit more relevant for later career stages. If you're just starting out and you're just starting to look for statistical support, sometimes you struggle to get what you need because of budgetary constraints, because you don't always have the resources to put towards statistical support. That's very common for junior investigators. It's hard to kind of get that off the ground in terms of that. And so any of the issues are related to that and not because of problems in the working relationship. But I think even if you're just starting out, it's kind of useful to think through what you want your longer term relationship with a statistician to be. So basically, your relationship with your statistician is just that. It's a relationship. It's a back and forth sharing of ideas. And I think that when it works the way it's supposed to, it's really win-win for everybody involved. It's a beautiful thing. The statistician gets a lot of benefit. We get engaging and fulfilling collaborations. Those collaborations support our own professional development. So for example, oftentimes when I have a collaborative relationship I'll work with the investigator and I'll take a look at their data and I'll say, oh, hey, there's a really interesting stats question that I think your data would be perfect for me to answer. Do you mind if I take the lead in writing a methodological paper and you can be the clinical collaborator on that paper? And that's a really great way for everybody to get more papers and for the statistician to kind of really be more embedded into the process. And then, you know, it's win-win for the clinical investigator too. Your research is going to be maximized by having a statistician involved at all phases of the research project. So that's the good side. If things aren't going so great, sometimes relationships fail, sometimes they're not a good fit. I think if you're not getting what you need from a statistician, or if you are a statistician and feel like you have a difficult relationship, then I think it's time to kind of take a step back and evaluate your expectations and evaluate communication. So basically, is the funding aligned? Has everybody communicated about how the statistician is going to be funded? Are we communicating about timelines, all those soft skill things? Have we talked through authorship and make sure everybody's on the same page, everybody's getting what they need there? So the first step is just to have a conversation and make sure and it's not just a one-time conversation. For me, a working relationship means always revisiting and always making sure that, that needs are being met. So if you aren't getting what you need from a statistician, first step, I would say talk to them. Sometimes it's just not a good fit and maybe you do need to keep looking. So I kind of liken it to mentorship relationships. So if you're a PhD student, you have a dissertation mentor. If you're a junior faculty member, maybe you have a career mentor in your department. And it's not always easy to find that mentor. You have to look for the right person, and it can take a while to find that right person. And it can be a little bit of the same thing with a statistician. So I think if things aren't working out the way they need to, and communication has happened and it's just still not aligning, then maybe there's some kind of mismatch in terms of funding or communication, and maybe it is time to explore other options. And if you happen to be the statistician, if you're a junior biostatistician and you're having trouble navigating these things, that's where a more experienced mentor could step in and help you out on that. I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so speaking of collaborations and working relationships, just to make things a little more interactive, if everybody could go to menti.com and enter in this 8-digit code, and this gives you a chance to enter in up to 8 keywords on how you would describe your ideal collaboration. We're kind of going to just take a few minutes and develop a word cloud together and see what pops up for people. And if you're not sure, if you haven't had that many collaborations, just, how would you describe your ideal relationship in general?
I also put the code in the chat if anyone wants to kind of copy and paste into Menti.
All right, I'm seeing a couple results come in. All right, if you want to stop sharing, Camille, I'll share real quick to show some of these results. And again, this, not totally scientific, not totally valid, but we don't have to be totally data driven all the time in our lives. So these are some of the terms that came out. One of the first things I see, obviously, is communication, mutual, engaging, long-term collaboration, fun. Absolutely. If we're not having fun at work, why are we here? Partnership, I love that. Shared workload, efficient, evolving, time management, specialized, absolutely. Sometimes you need really specialized statistical support and it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. educational, proactive, productive. Awesome. Yeah, those are all very cool. I'll leave that up in case there's more that come in, and I can always share it with the group after in our final slides, but I'll stop sharing and then we can go back to our normal slides. And then on to the next one.
There we go.
Yeah, and so this was it was really helpful to see everybody's ideas on this, because that's, we have a mix of people in our audience. We have statisticians and non-statisticians. This word cloud was at one point when I asked a bunch of biostatisticians how they would describe their ideal collaboration. And you see some of the same things: team, included, beginning, collaborative, kind of some of the same goal alignment there. And some of the key quotes from that group of biostatisticians were things like, the best projects are ones where I'm included as a true member of the team. This doesn't necessarily mean I was looped in on every email, but I was included and allowed to actively participate at all stages and see the drafts of papers before the "we're about to submit, can you give your blessing" stage. And another bullet point: a clear team leader, agreeing on all analyses beforehand and sticking to that, trusting each other's expertise, feeling comfortable giving lots of feedback to each other. And I think that's key. When someone sends me their aims for a grant, I don't just sign off on them and say, okay, looks great. I take a close look and I say, well, the way this aim is written, there might be difficulty writing the analysis plan because of this design issue. So maybe we should think about how to restructure this aim a little bit. And when I write a results section for a collaborator, I hope they can understand it. But if they have questions or they're not clear, then I'm not being clear, and it needs to be adjusted before that manuscript can be submitted. So it's a nice little back and forth there. All right. And then just a couple of notes about authorship before I pass things off to Camille. And this is all on the CETA webpage as well, but it's important to think about as you're bringing a statistician into your project, and it's important to think about if you are a statistician and how you navigate this with your collaborators. So I work for CETA, and our policy follows what are the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And so basically, according to these policies, pretty much any work that a biostatistician is doing on your manuscript is going to meet the criteria for authorship. So it'd be very rare for a biostatistician not to be a co-author on a manuscript. And CETA is not the only one that follows this policy. I know that Accords follows this. Other stats groups on campus follow this. I actually looked it up, and nationally across different biostats groups at different universities, this is a pretty common policy that people have. I think it's kind of a no-brainer that a statistician will be a co-author. But the hard part is it's usually a question of where in the order of authorship. And it can get a little tricky. You can have some miscommunication. Sometimes you can have some hurt feelings. I think my kind of main thoughts on this is there's not always a one-size-fits-all, so it's often a case-by-case basis. And I think this is really where communication is clear. They're like really imperative. I think authorship discussions should happen early in a project so everyone is clear on expectations, and they also might be revisited throughout a project. Maybe things change, maybe another person's brought in, maybe someone's role is less or more than what we initially thought, so then they get adjusted. But I think having those open lines of communication is pretty ideal. And then I think, if we have a long-term collaboration, so if I have someone that I'm working with for like 5 to 7 years, I don't think we're just going to have one paper. We're going to have multiple papers. So sometimes it balances out. Sometimes you win some and you lose some. Sometimes maybe I'm lower than I wanted to be on one paper, but then that kind of gets balanced out in another paper. So it's kind of this, you got to be a little bit flexible, but having communication about it is kind of the key. There are some general guidelines, which I'll run through real quickly. But like I said, there's kind of gray areas around these, and it really is a matter of communication and perspective. So there are situations where a biostatistician would be a first author on a paper. And that's where the biostatistician is really playing that first author role. They have a major role in either developing the project or the hypothesis generation. It's that example I gave before, where if I'm working with someone and I see a good stats question in their data, and I take the lead in doing the analyses and writing them up, that is a good example of where I would be expected to be first author. essentially the paper would not have happened without the contribution of that statistician. So that's kind of where you might see a statistician as a first author on a collaborative paper or a clinical paper of some kind. Second authorship is a very common place for a biostatistician, particularly when they're involved in the life cycle of a project. If they've been there since the beginning of the grant toward the end of data collection, that is like, grants where I'm FTE on for many, many years. Second authorship is a great place for the biostatistician. Another place where you might see second authorship for the biostatistician is if the statistician has some kind of unique analytical expertise. So, not all analyses, we all have our different areas of expertise. So for some analyses, you might need one specific statistician versus another. So second authorship might be where you couldn't just have any statistician on campus do the analyses, but maybe you have something like microbiome data or genomics or mediation, where you really need that specialized skill. And there it would be appropriate for your statistician to be probably at least second author. And then just a few other notes, middle listed author, that's probably pretty common when the biostatistician doesn't necessarily collaborate in the design of study, but conducts some kind of data analysis, writes the statistical methods section, and assists interpreting the results for conclusion. So basically, if the statistician comes on as more of the consultant, kind of that fixed project, then it might be appropriate to be in that middle listed author place. And then senior author, that doesn't happen a lot if you're, it's not very common for junior biostatisticians to be a senior author, but it gets more common as you progress in your career. And that's basically where the biostatistician is providing some kind of mentoring to the first author. So they're either offering guidance for the first author to conduct the analysis, they're helping the first author design the study. So a lot of one-on-one meeting time and a lot of additional analysis and paper writing support just beyond that typical collaborative role. So the statistician is really in that supportive position with that first author, with the PI. And these, like I said, these are guidelines. It really is a matter of discussion between all people involved. And I kind of link it to that consulting collaboration perspective, where consulting might fit more with that middle author position, whereas collaboration offers those opportunities for second authorship and first authorship and senior authorship for that matter too. And then one final note, like if there's a student, so oftentimes we'll have like a student do analyses and then they're mentored by a senior biostatistician. And then both the student and the senior person are included in the manuscript. Our general policy is that the student goes first and the senior person is right after them. I'm usually fine as long as the student is where they need to be. I'm fine. If I'm mentoring someone, that's always a matter of discussion too. So it can go a little further back, but generally that's the policy there. But again, always open for discussion.
I have a small point to add, which is that a lot of times as statisticians, we're asked to do some pretty crazy data wrangling, like taking giant data sets. And even if that's the only contribution that a statistician did for you, that does actually warrant authorship. So something to think about if you come to CETA and you need us to wrangle your COMPASS data, which I'll talk about a little bit, like almost in the next slide, but that does warrant authorship because that paper could not have happened without that contribution. Awesome.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so now we're going to kind of transition into finding a statistical consultant or collaborator. And so I wanted to start out with, when do you actually want to find a biostatistician? And I like to start out by kind of reminding people that I think a lot of people don't realize that biostatisticians are really trained, and Sarah got at this a little bit, but we're really trained in the entire research process. So everything from that idea generating stage to coming up with hypotheses and aims for a grant, all the way through to the final analysis and write-up of your manuscript. And so we want to help you at every single stage of that process. So you can come to us at any point, and we like to say the earlier you come to us, the better. But some examples of when you really might need a statistical consultant is if, like I said, designing a study and you don't really know exactly how to design a study that will answer the question you're trying to answer. A lot of times people come to us for the first time when they're trying to figure out how many subjects or samples they need to collect, and then also how many groups they, ideally want to compare versus how many groups they actually can compare based on the sample size. So as statisticians, we can really help you kind of like bridge that gap between how many people you ideally would like to have to answer a question versus how many people you may be actually, or subjects or samples you might be able to feasibly collect, and what you can answer based on those numbers. Sometimes you are working with methods or types of data that you're unfamiliar with. I know that a lot of people have some kind of basic statistics knowledge, but maybe you have never done a survival analysis before, or you don't know how to use the longitudinal model, for example. And this is a good time to call in a statistical consultant or collaborator to help you actually carry out that analysis. A lot of times, I would say almost one of the most common requests we get in the consulting center is people who have a volume of data that they just can't handle themselves. And that is totally reasonable. The biggest example of this is EHR data. It comes to us as kind of a relational database. A lot of people have not worked with a relational database before, and they, what you want to have is a rectangular data set, but you're just not quite there with what you have. So that's a really good time to come to a statistician, because we are also experts in data management and figuring out how to actually wrangle those multiple data sets with different information into one rectangular data set for analysis. Also, if you want to use the latest methods for design or analysis, I think I said this last year, but we're big geeks. We're all trying to learn as much as possible, learn the newest methods, the most elegant ways to deal with your data. It's why we have the word innovative in our title for CETA. And so, if you want to be using kind of the latest and greatest methods for your data, a statistical consultant or a biostatistician is really where to go. And like I said, we want to help set you up for success. We want you to be able to answer your research question. And so if you want to make sure that the research question you've envisioned can be answered with the data that you're collecting, that's a great time to come to a statistician. I pulled this quote from, there's like a link at the bottom of the slide here, but this, when you consult a statistician, what you expect, it's from the American Statistical Association. If this is something you're really interested in, I highly recommend taking a look. But the quote is that when you consult a statistician, you enlist the help of a professional who is particularly skilled at solving research problems. The statistician will try to guide you to the best way to obtain an answer to your research questions. So like I said, we want to help your research succeed. We know that you have maybe the clinical or the scientific expertise, and we want to bring in the statistical expertise to really solve that problem or answer that question. So where can you actually find statisticians? The best place to start would probably be your department. So there are several departments on our campus that have agreements with statisticians. So they use departmental funds to actually fund a statistician's time to help out with different research projects in that group, or to help develop grants, things like that. So for example, the Department of Medicine is huge, right? So the Division of Gastroenterology specifically funds my time to help them with unfunded projects, writing grants, things like that. If that doesn't exist, the next place to go would be to talk to your collaborators or your mentors and see if they have a statistician that they generally work with. That would be a good way to kind of connect with a statistician. And then more generally on campus, there are kind of like 4 main groups that provide statistical support. So Accords is for health services and outcomes research. CETA is us. CETA is kind of more general. So we have statisticians that are just kind of all over the board, all over the map in terms of expertise. Everything from like genomics to survey data, structural equation modeling, things like that. We have really like a really broad spectrum of expertise, and we kind of try to fill in the holes everywhere. If you are specifically doing pediatrics related research, the Children's Hospital Biostatistics support is probably your best option. It is heavily subsidized for this group. And then the Cancer Center likewise has, similar, I think they have the same prices as us if you are just doing, general research, but if you are involved in cancer-focused research, there's a discount for people who are working within that scope. So there's kind of more specific places you can find support, and then CETA tries to kind of be the more generalist bucket on campus. Some tips for finding a statistician is that you sometimes will need to find a statistician with specific expertise. So an example of this is that while there is support all over in some of these other areas for biostat support, if you need genomic support specifically or omics type projects, you probably want to come to CETA because we have experts in that area. So sometimes you will need to find someone with that specific expertise, and you can always contact us at CETA and we can try to help you with that wayfinding of how to find that expert. And also, while we are, like I said, big nerds, we don't know everything about everything related to numbers. All of us have our own area of expertise. There will be a lot of times your statistician might say, I don't know the answer to that. I will go find out for you. And so, it's something just to keep in mind when you're talking to your statistician, that they probably won't know everything and every method out there, and that's okay. The other thing I like to remind you kindly is that we do not work for free. We are professionals like everyone else. Please be prepared to pay for statistical support, whether that be your department helping to fund part of a statistician, whether that be properly funding a statistician to work on a grant, or whether that be kind of our fee-for-service small consulting to help you either answer your research question or do data management, things like that. When you're looking for a statistician, there are a couple of things that are really important to look for. First is kind of obvious, right? You want a statistician who knows statistics and is up to date with current literature. And I think that's really, I'm kind of tooting our own horn here, but I think that's one of the strengths about CETA specifically is, we are in a group housed with other statisticians. We are constantly learning from each other, going to conferences, and I know statisticians all over this campus are doing the same thing. So just like someone who is really trying to stay up to date with the current literature, the current practices, new study designs, things like that. I don't think that statisticians are famous for being great communicators, but it is really, really important that we are great communicators. And this can be both in written communication and oral communication. You eventually want your research product to be published in the world, so we can be moving science forward. And so you need a statistician who can really help to communicate in writing what they did and what the interpretation is of that result. So that written communication is really important. And the oral communication is important, not only just for the relationship, but you want a statistician who can help you understand what was done. There's like some theory that statisticians are teachers, and I don't necessarily think it's our job to teach you statistics, but I do think it is our job to teach you how to understand statistics, how to properly take the results that were generated from your project and interpret that into like a real life consequence, a real life result that can be shared with the general public. And so having a statistician who has the communication skills to be able to actually get you from, an output from some sort of statistical software to really being able to communicate what you did in your project and how that impacts, the population that you're looking at is really, really important. We can't be there when you're standing in front of your poster to tell you exactly what was done. And so we need to be able to kind of coach you in order to do that. And likewise, we'll need that communication from your end to be able to understand maybe from the clinical side or the scientific side, so that we can help really bridge the gap between the numbers and the actual interpretation. And the teaching plays into being able to explain statistical concepts. And what you'll really want is for someone who can ask relevant, probing questions and is a really good listener. A lot of my job is asking people questions about their research and trying to put together exactly what they are trying to get at so that I can translate that into an actual analysis. So I spend a lot of my time, scoping out projects, asking people a lot of different questions about their research in order to put together a very specific statistical analysis plan that will actually be able to answer their research question. And that requires asking lots and lots and lots of questions. Clearly, you want someone who meets deadlines and is responsive. You want them to have relevant research experience that plays back into the the expertise, making sure the expertise matches the project that you're working on. And you also want someone who respects research ethics. I put this in here because there are, I think when we work with certain collaborators, not certain collaborators, a lot of times people are really excited about their research. They've done a ton of work to actually get their data, and they want to get as much out of it as possible. And so as a statistician, it's kind of our job to kind of pump the brakes a little bit and be able to say, we need to really focus on a primary research question so that we can, maximize our what we have here, instead of looking at 50 different research questions, in which case your paper becomes kind of more exploratory than anything else. So by respecting the ethics of not running a million different tests on the same data set, that can help just create stronger research, a stronger research project. And that is something that a statistician could and should do as part of your research team. So when you are meeting, I think it was almost 50% of people said they had never met with a statistician or never collaborated or consulted with a statistician before. So to kind of get you an idea, I just said we're going to ask you a ton of questions. The next couple of slides are really just a lot of questions that we are going to ask you. And so this will hopefully help you prepare for kind of what you should be expected to come to the table with when you meet with a statistician. So the first thing we're going to want really is an overview of your project and the study design. So again, this is going to help us kind of orient into the context of your research so that we can start to put together kind of what are the methods that are going to get at the actual question that you're trying to ask. A lot of times, I think this is not, what am I trying to say? We don't need to be experts in your field. Sometimes we will when we become close collaborators, but even in a consulting situation, we need to understand what's going on in your clinical or maybe bench research project so that we can really figure out what is the appropriate method. We're going to ask you your primary and secondary research questions. And I phrase it this way because a lot of times we see people come with 100 different questions that they want to ask. And really, when we think about this from a statistical perspective, every single time that you are asked, that you run a hypothesis, you're kind of using up some of the power of your study, right? And so we want to make sure that we don't have to make 50 adjustments because we were running 50 analyses. Maybe there's just 2 primary things you want to look at. And so we can just make a small adjustment to make sure that we are, really focused and not committing, a type 1 error. We will ask you to describe your population of interest. What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? I'm so used to working in the clinical world that I try to think about this also in the bench science world as well. But we really want to figure out, what is the subgroup that you specifically want to see in these data so that we can make sure that's what's actually there and that's what's actually collected. This becomes really important when you're working with giant data sets so that we can make sure that those are were filtered properly. We want to know the patient characteristics that are important to account for and whether they're available in the data that you have collected or are going to collect. Basically, we want to know, what are the things that people are accounting for in their models in this body of research. If every single paper in your field is accounting for age and sex, you need to make sure that you are collecting age and sex so that you can adjust for that in your model, things like that. And because otherwise it doesn't really fit into the body of research that exists. And we want this to be, a successful research project. what are you hoping to show in your results? I think sometimes this is helpful for a lot of different reasons. One of them being that if you think the age is really positively correlated with your outcome, and we see that it's super negatively correlated with your outcome, we know that that's a red flag, and we can come to you and say, is your outcome maybe not measured the way you thought it was, things like that. So that can kind of help us to figure out what's going on with your data and make sure that the results that we are providing for you actually make sense. And we'll want to know what the intended end product of your project is. If you are planning on a full manuscript, we want to make sure we're providing a full write-up that includes the methods, the results, the interpretation of the results, maybe some tables and figures that are, ready for publication, things like that. Does anyone have things they would add to this list? Someone says I'm looking in the comments, academics do not typically get monetary support from collaborations. It's trained to consider salary support for statistical collaboration. So I think my response to this would be, when there's a grant that's funded, right? You would expect as the collaborator to get support on that from that grant. And then likewise, the statistician would expect to get support for that. And this is why I think this comment kind of plays into why it's so important that we have structures that allow for departmental support of statisticians, because that provides that kind of infrastructure. It's Sarah said this earlier, but like one of the biggest things we hear from people is that they just can't afford the support. And so trying to figure out or trying to convince your department that this is a resource that's really important to pay for, I think is reasonable.
Yeah, I agree. Whenever there's that kind of, I think it's tough with the junior investigators in particular. If you're writing a K grant or something like that, it's always hard to consider enough FTE for the statistical support that would be required for that statistician. But that's where kind of taking that life cycle and having some kind of departmental infrastructure or some kind of campus infrastructure, like through Accords or the Bird or something like that. Because I think the bottom line is I think most statisticians working on campus are in soft money positions. And so I think if we're not funded as an FTE on a grant, the money for our salary support has to come from somewhere. So kind of developing that collaboration and thinking about how we can kind of get that, be successful with grant funding together as a team is the ideal scenario. But then starting out at the early stage, early career investigators, starting out with more of that infrastructure support for things like K awards or things like, pilot data analyses or things like that.
And we'll talk about a couple of resources that are actually free at the end as well. But I guess those are not technically free because they are like supported by the Bird. All right, so then the last set of questions I told you statisticians ask a lot of questions. The last set of questions I have is questions that we're going to ask you about your data. And so you should be prepared to answer these questions. What's the sample size? We want to know, maybe you have a super, super rare disease. That's important to know so we can figure out, what is the appropriate way to actually analyze these data. And the other thing to think about with sample size is if it's too small, we can't actually do any real comparisons. And so we're going to need to, maybe we can only summarize those. So the sample size is a really important place where we generally start. We're going to ask you for the type of data that you have so that we can kind of figure out whether, for example, you have longitudinal data or time to event data, because that's going to affect the type of analysis that we would do. We want to know how many observations you have per person or patient or participant. I realize, again, a lot of these are in the clinical sense, so I apologize to the bench scientists in the room. We want to know how the outcomes are measured, specifically in your data set. This is so important. A lot of people have an outcome in mind, but they haven't thought through exactly how that's going to be measured in the data that they've collected. And so making that connection between what is the outcome you're really interested in and how is it actually measured is going to be a really important connection to make. And your statisticians should help you make that connection. We want to know which variables are going to be relevant for analysis and what type of data they are. We'll ask you about any scores in your data. A lot of times people have different scores and that need to be calculated. We want to know how your data were collected. Specifically, we want to know if it's EHR data. Data management is very time consuming and that translates to being very expensive. So it's important that we know kind of like the volume of data as well. And we want you to think through what biases might be present in these data. For example, if you're looking at labs, are labs taken more often on sicker patients? And so that might kind of skew your results or skew how much data you have on certain people. There are a lot of biases that are present in EHR data that we don't even really think about because we kind of think about it as this like automatic ground truth, but it's very important to step back and think about what might actually have been happening behind the scenes when these data were collected. And we'll also need to know if there are a significant amount of missing data, because that's going to be a challenge in terms of our analysis and might require some more, some more sophisticated statistical methods to actually do something like imputation. Are there any other questions that you would add to this list? I will say our tagline at CETA is like, we want to know what's in your data, what's in your data. So I think that goes really hand in hand with having a conversation with a biostatistician, because that's ultimately what we're really interested in, is really digging into your data. And then my only comment here too, not my only comment, I just made a comment. Oh, ask for code books. That's a great one. Thank you for that. Yes, ask for code books so that you can actually understand the data. Thank you, Wendy. And then I guess my caution is that data collection always takes about 10 times longer than you expect, even when you're just trying to pull EHR data. So just make sure that you are prepared for it to take a long, long time. Oh, thank you, Lala, for sharing. Lala just shared the attendance. I'm pretty much done. So Lala shared the attendance. Yeah, what is your timeline? That's an important one too. Thank you, Sharon. There's a link to for the attendance in the chat, and please fill that out so that you can be entered for one of our raffles. So this is a CETA talk. So this is our website if you're interested in connecting with us. And great question, Connie, because there are a couple of different ways that you can partner with us. We can help you. Actually, we offer free grant writing support with the caveat that we ask you to write in proper FTE for a biostatistician on that grant. So we are happy to help you with your writing your K award, and we just ask that you come about 60 days before the deadline. So you can absolutely come to our website and you'll see these, and you can get in the queue for working on a grant. If you have one of those 5-minute questions, we do have free 1-hour consults. We offer, I think, like 2 free consults every 60 days, I think is our policy, but you can come and kind of get some questions answered, figure out if you're on the right track, and maybe figure out if what you're dealing with really requires a statistician. And then you can either come and work with us kind of on a more consulting basis, or we could try to think about, if you're interested in having someone embedded in your unit, building a bigger partnership that would include, having actually some FTE of a biostatistician. So how you would find this is you would come to our website and click on develop a grant. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me or Sarah at our emails. And this is just the first talk of Data Week. Last year we closed it. This year we're opening it. There are a lot more talks to come, specifically in SAS and R, a lot of really great. Oh, regex is one of them. So please, 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 if you're interested in kind of getting more, in the weeds in stats skills, both in SAS and R and programming, we really encourage you to attend. And I think that's all we have. So thank you so much. And thank you to Sarah for doing this talk with me again. Lala, do you have anything else to add?
I think you covered it. Thank you both so much for doing this. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.